Hello and welcome back, and it's time for another Before You Buy or Should You Buy, and today we're of course looking at the Zimablade. This is a system we've already talked about on the channel a fair few times, and although we've done a big old review on this along with some performance testing and certainly an Applex Media server test video which I think is already live, I will say right now that those videos are a little long and I think a number of you are in a rush. It's 2023, you've got stuff to do. So in today's video we're going to cut straight to the meat and potatoes. I'm going to give you 5 reasons why the Zimablade may well be the perfect DIY home lab play around device, or even more than that for you. But I'm also going to give you 5 reasons why you might want to sit on the fence a bit longer or just shop elsewhere. So why don't we stop wasting your time and crack on with number 1. Let's face it, it's obvious, isn't it? This thing is dirt cheap. Starting at $64 on Crowd Supply right now, at least until the end of the year. Right now, in terms of its crowdfunding campaign, it is absolutely smashing it. And when it does roll out, obviously that price is going to go up. But even taking it all into account, right now at the time of this recording, you can get hold of this for $64. The $64 mark gives you the dual-core version, arriving with the N3350 CPU, but it doesn't include any memory. But it does include ready to go. It arrives with 2 SATA ports that are on the side. It arrives with 2 USB ports, one of which is the power. It also arrives with a gigabit LAN port there, more on that later on, and a DisplayPort Mini out there, which is 60 frames at 4K. Ready to go straight there. And again, you will need to put memory inside it. You can pick up $10, $20 sewed in very, very easily on your Amazon and you like, or you can spend $72, you can spend $89, you can go up to $144, of which you will get not only the quad-core version of this using the N3450 Celeron processor, but it also arrives with that USB power. It arrives with a SATA cage for your hard drives. It includes enhanced SATA connectors there, and just better overall completed package there, and 16 gig of memory, which even when you look at the figure of $144 is still crazy cheap for a ready to go 2-bay NAS that actually even has storage inside that the OS is based on, that you can use third-party OSs. The point I'm making is you just cannot question the price point, and even, as many of you said in the comments, you challenge that by saying, well, you can get good AS ROC and Topton and CWWK motherboards right now that have got in a newer generation Celerons on board, the N5105, the N6000 series CPU there, or you go for some of the other more compact ready-made motherboards. Even factoring that in, you simply are not going to get a lower price point. You may get more modern hardware, but you simply will not be able to get, for example, the Topton with the N5105 CPU and 16 gig of memory and the ability to deploy it immediately, which is important at this scale because you still need to get a case, a PSU, and all the periphery of cabling. You won't get that for between $64 and $144 respective to this. So just right now, in terms of cheap and priceness, it's unbelievable. Next up, this is something you must have mentioned when I'm waving this around on camera. I mentioned this on the review when we went into more detail. This thing is custom case ready, notwithstanding that it looks like an old retro tape player, and it can be deployed as is with 2 SATA drives connected out one way and all of your other peripheral cables out the other way. But on top of that, you've got that PCIe on the top, which ultimately means that this system is very customizable but very small, and you can use an old PC case, you can use a modified old Sega Mega Drive case if you choose. The levels of customization for this are comparable, and in many respects in terms of hardware integration, better potentially than that of Raspberry Pi, something more on that later on, simply because it is deployable as is, but also deployable within a third party, even a USB DAS or JBOD box, and then wire the drives into this directly. You can reuse those old enclosures with this, and with its low power consumption of either the dual core at 6 TDP and the quad core at 10 TDP, USB-C power that arguably does require either a high-powered USB connection or a USB power adapter there, so not just standard easy off the kilter USB, still means that you've got a very low powered, low physical impact device that you can install in a greater custom build. And remember, you've got that PCIe slot there at the top. What does that mean? That means that PCIe slot, why don't we slam on Wi-Fi 6, why don't we slam on 10 GBE? Why don't we slam on a SATA adapter to add more drives? Why don't we add a multi-port Ethernet adapter? Why don't we add, hell, from QNAP, a 10 GBE and M2 NVMe adapter, or just go NVMe on its own? The point I'm making is the upscalability and creativity that's gone into this in an external casing, thanks to its size, is genuinely unique in the marketplace. And if you're looking for a nice, easy but customizable custom build for your NAS server and keeping it unique, it's really hard to beat. Indeed, in the background of this channel right now, I'm actually working on a custom build for this that's going to go as follows. It's going to be the device itself. It's going to be a USB with Wi-Fi 6E attached to it. It's going to be 10 GBE with M2 NVMe slots. It's going to be those two SATA hard drives there. And, you know, quite crazy of all, it's going to have its own battery supply. This is a power supply from the company SharkGeek, who have supplied this, and we're going to be utilizing this via its USB power directly into this device, and allow us to have a device that not only is going to be able to be charging from the wall, much like a UPS, but when it comes to portability, I'll be able to lift this whole enclosure up with all of the added 10 GBE, M2 NVMe and Wi-Fi 6 capabilities in that SATA cage as a portable NAS device that I can use on the move wirelessly or via a 10 GBE for editing. And when I get back, connect my power to this device, and then boom, my NAS is then charging. That is how scalable and customizable this is, and I'm really looking forward to showing you that video. But mainly, it's just an indication, even right now in these early stages, of just how flexible, customizable, and custom build ready this little thing is. Next up, we covered this a lot more in a lot more detail on both the video on the Zimablade and the Zimaboard before, but the Casa OS that this system arrives with is pretty darn impressive when you really factor in just what you're getting for that money. Because remember, all of that cost we talked about thus far is about hardware. I didn't even touch on the fact that it arrives with an OS that is deployable immediately. There is genuine out-the-box deployment. There's no mucking around setting up an account, no mucking around setting up certain storage peripherals in advance. It is turn it on and it appears on the network. You don't even need to directly KVM for the first time. Just plug it into the power, plug it into the network with a network interface, turn on your local laptop or PC, look at the local area network, type in find Zima, and you will find the device and access the Casa OS, setting up your authentication password and more from that. It is that straightforward, and it utilizes standard container interface when it comes to the apps, so you can either choose to go completely custom and go on command line to access repositories for your containers of choice, or you can use the App Center to immediately access and one click and install a myriad of different applications completely available at your disposal, alongside file management tools, network management tools, and a whole bunch of toolkits that allow you to make the most of this system from within the OS. I'm not going to say it's as highfalutin as the likes of DSM or QTS, but it does have a lot of features and functionality at an entry level in still a user-friendly way, which, given that it's included in that lower end price tag, is still bloody impressive in my opinion. Next up, I mentioned it earlier on, this system supports up to 16 gig of memory. Now, not only is it good that it supports up to 16 gig, which means it can support enough base level memory for pretty much any NAS OS, although the CPU is a little old, more on that later on. It's also worth highlighting that unlike its predecessor and other more affordable systems that have pre-soldered memory, that's NAND flash immediately soldered to the board so you can't upgrade it, this system arrives with a SODIMM slot inside. That means that inside this you can go ahead and install a 2, a 4, an 8 or a 16 gig memory slot depending on your requirements. It's only one slot, but that level of customization for that memory, meaning you don't have to immediately get locked in with a higher amount of memory and pay for more than you need, or start with too little a memory that you've got no means to scale up. You've got that. It's just a shame they didn't include that on the Zimaboard. It was one of my few complaints about the predecessor, and I'm glad they rectified it in this new unit. And this last point is going to be controversial and it is going to annoy some users, and I've sort of alluded to it already, but I think this is better than a Raspberry Pi. I really do. Why is that? Well, several different things. Number one, not all, some of the newer generation ones and newer generation deployment The majority of Raspberry Pis do not give you that means to upgrade the memory in the same way. On top of that, Raspberry Pis don't really have direct out-the-box PCIe connectivity in most cases, and require bridging mechanics and bridging hardware in the majority of cases, apart from the very recent releases into the Raspberry Pi architecture. But probably more than anything, it's the CPU, because although the CPU is a little old, something I'll talk about later on, it is still an Intel Celeron. It's still a 64-bit x86 processor, whereas the bulk of Raspberry Pi is based around the concept of using ARM processors, ARM. Now, the difference between x86 and ARM have been explored on many channels, including this one. But to keep it in brief, ARM processors, and they're found in a lot of very cost-effective NAS devices, I will add, ARM-based processors from companies like Realtek, from companies like Annapurna, the Amazon company, and Marvell, these CPUs are designed to use as little power as possible. You find them inside mobile phone devices, you find them inside Chromebooks, you find them inside portable devices that more often than not built on battery use. Now, the way ARM processors work, and there's a lot more to it than this, but an oversimplification would be that instructions that are all handled on a computer by the CPU. Again, this ARM CPU in the case of Raspberry Pis. Now, instructions to and from that CPU need to be compressed. The reason being that an ARM CPU needs all the instructions to be compressed smaller so it can use less power when executing these across the whole system. Again, an oversimplification, but that's the general gist. That's good because it uses less power to get the job done. But unfortunately, that also means that some instructions to and from the CPU are simply too complex to be compressed without even making them inexecutable, or just resulting in them not doing what they're supposed to do. And ultimately that means that ARM-based CPUs, although very, very good in certain contexts, when it comes to static NAS deployment, or when you want to run things like virtual machines, when you want to use highly graphic-enabled processes, they're not as good as x86 processors from AMD and Intel. These are CPUs that, although can use compressed line instruction, can also deal with nice, raw, easy, big instruction for the larger tasks that you may want your NAS to do in 2023 and 2024. That's another reason why this, to me, is better than a Raspberry Pi, because it's not a dissimilar size to a Raspberry Pi and not a dissimilar power consumption to that of a Raspberry Pi, but it counters it with better customization in terms of that PCI upgradability, CPU and memory options built into it that can handle larger processes and more entrepreneurial and aggressive OSs and applications, and ultimately make it, for me, a better choice compared with Raspberry Pi right now. But it's not going to be for everyone, and alongside those 5 good things, there are the 5 things that might make you want to give this thing a miss entirely.
Come on, that's just the way it is.
Come on, I've said it several times, that CPU is showing its dang age. The CPU choices inside this are the N3350 or the N3450. Both Celeron processors, but circa 2015-16 CPUs. Indeed, we saw that CPU in the likes of Synology and QNAP NASes some 5, 6, 7 years ago. Now, even Intel themselves have kind of dropped that CPU several refreshes ago, and although that CPU does result in a lower base level clock speed, with the base level clock speed of both the dual and the quad core CPU being in the 1 GHz bracket and only cracking into the 2.4 and the 2.2 GHz for the quad and dual core CPU on burst when needed, it still means that both the integrated graphics in burst and standard and the standard power consumption, clock speed of these CPUs is still quite lackluster in 2023, and will result in the CPU not being as efficient as more modern CPUs like the Celeron J6412 or the N5105, or some of the Pentium like the 6005 CPU out there. Now, of course, if they use those CPUs, they'd probably have to charge more for the system or have to readapt the cooling system on this, and saying this issue of one of my negatives being related to keeping things small and affordable, get used to hearing that, because pretty much that affects every single one of these. It has to be said that that CPU is showing its age, and just spending a little bit more, again, as I mentioned in the intro, in some of the pre-made motherboards from things like the Topton or the AS Rock series, you can get better CPUs, but just remember, then you lose out on the scale of this device and the pricing.
Come on, that's just the way it is.
Next up, for all of my praise that I gave this about having that upgradable memory slot there, which I really like over its predecessor, one of my criticisms of the Zimablade that came before it was not addressed in this system, and that is the base level storage. This system arrives with 32 gigabytes of pre-soldered MMC storage memory inside. That's for storing the Casa OS, but you can put third-party OSs on there, as well as, run things like Unraid over USB if you choose. But 32 gig is not a lot. And the minute you start rocking in updates, the minute you start rocking in kind of internal deploying applications, and you don't want to be overly reliant on externally hot-plugged storage, it's not going to be for everyone. And I wish they'd included an option to have an M2 NVMe slot. It didn't have to be full size. They could maybe have settled on SATA. Would still only be 6 gig, but stick in an SATA slot. Alternatively, put in an NVMe on ×1 speed, perhaps in there. Don't go for a full-length SSD if it's a spacing issue. Go for a 2230 or a 2242 length M2 NVMe inside this. It's just a shame that the base level storage of this is so small, and although they've given you the option to add internal hard drives or SSDs, or add external hard drives or SSDs, it's the fact that it's pretty much a necessity, because that 32 gig is just simply not enough.
Come on, that's just the way it is.
Now, this next criticism is going to appear a little petulant, but one of the things that really wound me up about this device in terms of its presentation, and for me a bit of a misstep on the campaign, is when you go for that $64 model of this, you get the dual-core model without the memory inside, fine, but you also get this little cable. Oh, and you get a USB cable as well for the power, but you get this little cable. This is a SATA and power connector to combined SATA and power port. What that's for is so you can connect it to the back of this device very easily, attach the power, and boom, you've now got the option to add an internal hard drive. Good stuff, right? Why am I criticising it? Well, it's because using this cable takes away one SATA and one power, and now we've got a SATA left on its own with no power on this. You've got a 2-port system with a cable that only allows you to attach one drive. Now, if you go for one of the higher tier options or go to their website, you can get this cable. This cable, which has 2 SATAs going into one power, that allows you to power 2 hard drives, thereby allowing you to take advantage of both of those ports. My complaint is, what is the point of this cable? Just include this cable by default. Get this cable by default and increase the price. What? $5, $10? Go nuts. Because it seems madness to me. I understand that a user might buy the dual-core version of this with no memory, because they might have sewed-in memory knocking around that they don't want to throw away or waste. That makes sense. But that single cable, for me, is effectively obsolete, giving me a system that has 2 SATA bays on it, but giving me a cable that only has one of those. Gives me the option of 2. Just include this cable. It's a small petulant complaint, but I don't like any kind of e-waste on these things, and for me that is particularly wasteful.
Come on, that's just the way it is.
Circling back to what I was talking about with that PCIe, I do like the PCIe slot on this. I like that even though it's a ×4 slot, that they've gone to the trouble of cutting the end, so there's no limitation if you use a ×8 or ×16 card there. You will need to use particular backplanes on this, which again you can remove, and most cards these days arrive with different backplane add-ons, but it's nice to have that PCIe slot. But what's my complaint? Well, because of that CPU choice necessitated by keeping this thing compact and keeping it within a certain price point, the result is this slot is is Gen 2 times 4. That's not great. To put that into perspective, if it was Gen 2 gives you 500 megabytes per second bandwidth, and times 4 takes that number and times it by 4. So you've got 2,000 megabytes per second to play with there. Now, that sounds alright, but that means when you start attaching things, think like a 10G card, that'll be fine, because you only need 1,000 megs. If you want to use a Wi-Fi 6 card, you're fine. If you want to use a SATA adapter card, you're absolutely fine. That's a 5-port card. You've got enough to play with there. But when you start using beefier cards, say this 4 times 2.5G, it'll be fine. But the minute you start using dual port cards, even if it's 2 times 10G, which is technically you've got enough bandwidth, you're really hitting the sides friction wise. And then when you start looking at M2 NVMe upgrade cards, or you start looking at combo cards, 2,000 megs isn't a lot of bandwidth to be playing with, and the consequence is that these are going to be throttled quite significantly. And I haven't even got onto if you start wanting to use graphics cards for things like a Plex Media server or pretty decent VMs. Ultimately, I get why it has to be Gen 2 because of that CPU and the diminished number of lanes and the architecture of that CPU being Gen 2 to start with. But in 2023, there are a lot of Gen 3 Intel Celerons out there, a number of which I've already mentioned, that will give you a lot more bandwidth to play with for your build.
Come on, that's just the way it is.
And finally, this is something I was only really aware of since my review, so I couldn't go into a vast amount of detail about it because I didn't have the extensive amount of time with the device, and that is the base of this thing and the back can get real hot. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, as you saw in my review, the top is plastic, the sides are plastic, but the CPU on the base is connected to this base level metal panel and the ridged heatsink panel there on the rear. This is so it can draw heat from those components and then dissipate them into the surrounding environment. I had this device mounted here on top of that hard drive cage there, and I was running things like Plex Media Server. I was running a number of the the container applications inside, and I'll be straight with you, this thing gets real hot, and although it's fanless and silent, if you're going to deploy it in any kind of custom casing, you're definitely going to need to add some sort of active cooling fan. Well, we checked utilizing a number of onboard container tools to look at things that were running on this. It became very apparent that this thing could very, very quickly hit 70 to 80 degrees without even really trying too hard. Now, part of that is because of the age of that CPU not being quite as efficient as modern CPUs, but the lack of an active cooling fan was also a big factor in that. So just bear in mind that this system, although silent, if you're really going to use it to its potential, you're going to need a fan, which is going to undermine that silence on it. It's something we just couldn't know until we did our deeper testing into the device. But this has been our Before You Buy, Should You Buy on the Zimablade from Icewhale. Let me know what you guys think. Are you a backer of this project or not? Did you see the review and agree or disagree? Maybe there are points I have missed. Let me know in the comments. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. Use the free advice section over on NAS Compare if you need help. Our Discord, if you want to talk more and more to other NAS enthusiasts. Use our Ask NAS Compares forum for a little bit more tech support there. Or go over to our Patreon and Ko-Fi if you want to get access to these videos early, as well as get expedited support from myself and editors. Just us at NAS Compares, and there are links in the description to the full review and more on DIY systems like this. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.